Marhaban to my channel, Hamza the Historian. My name is Hamza, and I am going to talk about the greatest figure, the zenith, the epitome, the highest point of the Mu'tabirun movement. And he is the figure who brought i'tibar, contemplation on the signs of God in nature, to get access to the ghaib, to build your iman, your faith, get access to the unseen, al-ghaib. And his name is Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, the famous Sufi Ibn Arabi, who is buried in Damascus, Syria, who there's a whole Sufi order, a tariqah, called the Akbari tariqah, al-Tariqah al-Akbariyya, and who's probably most famous inheritor nowadays is Sheikh Samir al-Nas of Damascus, Syria. And Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi is the name that the journal here is named after, the Journal of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society. And he's someone that not only Muslim scholars have been very interested in, but Orientalist scholars as well, because he had such a massive output of writing, but also he's very idiosyncratic. He is often described by Orientalists as being a free thinker, as he's a very spiritual person who tries to talk about the ineffable, tries to talk about spiritual experiences that you can't really put into words actually. And Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, he tries to talk about these ineffable, esoteric, spiritual experiences that most people don't even dare to write about or convey with human language, because human language is so limited. And it's for that reason he is so interesting to so many people. And so the most famous work from Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, his magnum opus, if you will, is al-Futūḥāt al-Makkiyya, which is pictured just right behind me, right there. That's the al-Sādr version. There's other, editions of it. And the guy who edited that edition right there, his last name is al-Ghurab, and he is a personal childhood friend of Sheikh Samir al-Nas, who I mentioned earlier, who is the modern day inheritor, if you will, of this Sufi tradition, the modern day practicing Sufi, who embodies Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. And besides just the Futūḥāt al-Makkiyya, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi also wrote many other works. Famously, you have Fusus al-Hikam, you have many books, some of which are pictured behind me in translation or in the original Arabic. And there's a vast amount of Orientalist literature that is written about Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi's thought. He's written tons of poetry, just you might say general literature like Muḥaḍarāt al-Abrar, and these different, all different kinds of treatises and books out there. One could dedicate their entire lifespan to studying Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi and maybe just get one drop of the entire ocean of his knowledge. And you truly will drown in his writings, okay? And that's Sufi terminology there for you, some metaphors. So Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi is probably the most influential Sufi figure, especially in the medieval period and in modernity. Aspects of his thought every major Sufi thinker had to engage with. Even Ibn Taymiyyah, who was his probably most famous detractor and critic, who belonged to the Qadri Sufi order. Ibn Taymiyyah did. And so, Ibn Arabi is somebody that every Muslim has to at least know something about, who this guy is. And he's not to be confused with Abu Bakr ibn Arabi, who is the Maliki jurist. Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, as we will find out, is idiosyncratic when it comes to the law. And my claim is that he was al-Zahiri in fiqh. And that's why the previous video was about Ibn Hazm, because I think that Ibn Hazm had a big influence on Muhyiddin ibn Arabi when it comes to Islamic law. And so today I want to talk about, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi's life, his basic biography, how he was raised, and that type of thing. So I'm going to read a prepared text here on Muhyiddin ibn Arabi's life. The Shaykh al-Akbar, Muhyiddin Muhammad bin Ali bin Muhammad al-Arabi al-Ta'i al-Hatimi, who lived from 1165 to 1240 CE, was born into a wealthy upper-class Yemeni military family, the only son of the family at that. Addas, Claude Addas, says, as the son of a noble and rich family, Muhyiddin's years of adolescence were peaceful and carefree. He did not attend any madrasa or Quran school, but being from a wealthy family, he had a private Quran instructor and probably had private tutors who taught him all the subjects of a privileged upbringing. So you might think in maybe modern American context, this is a kid who grew up with extreme wealth, maybe the kid of Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, for instance, who went to one of the top Ivy League schools like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, University of Chicago, Columbia, and so on, and had amazing multidisciplinary education, probably got a PhD in secular type studies. Because when you read Ibn Arabi and he talks about these religious subjects, it's intertwined with a bunch of what we would call nowadays secular knowledge. Although it's important to note that in pre-modern times, the division between secular and religious did not exist. There was no concept. That was a concept that evolved out of Enlightenment philosophy in the West. Everything indicated that the young Muhammad ibn Arabi would have a military career, as he even said about himself, since I was old enough to wear a sword belt, I did not cease mounting steeds, examining saber blades, parading in military camps, instead of poring over the pages of books. So Muhyiddin ibn Arabi's father was a high-ranking military official of some sort of capacity. However, later in life, his disposition for books and learning must have become apparent, for instead of a military trajectory, he would be promised a position as a scribe to the government of Seville. It is said that when young Ibn Arabi saw the Caliph Abu Yusuf, Ya'qub's son, Prince Abu Bakr, praying, Ibn Arabi asked himself, if someone like this, who is no less than the sovereign of this country, submissive and humble, and behaves in such a way towards God, it is because this lower world is nothing. Ibn Arabi then said, I left him that same day, never to see him again, and undertook the path, meaning the Sufi path, the Sufi journey, the journey of a mystic, of a renunciant, of a mu'tabar. And so imagine someone who maybe they have a PhD, from Harvard, their family's a military general, and they just, are promised some position in the military, and they just give it all up. Give up academia, give up whatever military opportunities could have got through his father, and became like a wandering monk. This is kind of the life that Muhyiddin ibn Arabi chose. This had such an impact on the young Muhammad ibn Arabi that he became a renunciant and retreated into a cave like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Prophet Muhammad. But this cave was in a cemetery. There he fell asleep and saw Muhammad Jesus, and Moses, all urging him to take up a life of asceticism, renunciation, and adherence to the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Ibn Arabi said, "I awoke in tears and devoted the rest of the night to chanting the Quran. Then I resolved to dedicate myself to God's path." He also said, "I began my retreat before dawn and I received illumination before sunrise. I remained in this place for 14 months and I obtained secrets about which I later wrote. My spiritual opening at that moment was an ecstatic uprooting." Shortly thereafter, Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, the state-appointed judge of Cordoba, who was the confidant and physician of the caliph, requested to see this young man, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. And remember, as we talked about in previous videos, this Maliki philosopher, state jurists who acted almost as wazirs, as governors or, very high government officials. They were the ones who had all the power in Islamic Spain. And so Ibn Rushd was somebody who had a lot of power. Even to this day, his text Bidayat al-Mujtahid is a text that is used by Muslim jurisconsults, muftis. It's used to train muftis, who give fatwas. So his influence is still very much felt, and he's known for his famous refutation of Imam Ghazali. And so Ibn Rushd wanted to see Ibn Arabi. However, after finding that his judicial philosophical methodology was not confirmed by the young Muhammad ibn Arabi's vision, Ibn Rushd cringed, lost his color, and was overcome with doubt. So Ibn Rushd wanted to ask, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, what's the best way to be Muslim? What's the best way to live life? Was my methodology confirmed in the spiritual visions that you had? And Ibn Arabi said no. And I've heard some Orientalists say that, perhaps this is just a polemical thing that was inserted into the text, or perhaps Ibn Arabi was just saying this as a way to say that Ibn Rushd's methodology was completely wrong. But, I have a hunch that this could have possibly happened. I mean, it's not inconceivable by any thought of the mind that this actually occurred. Just because it may have a polemical or sectarian reading to it doesn't mean that's exactly what it was, or that it is made up and didn't occur. And for me, that's a major problem with the Western critical historical method. It claims to be secular, but it still has vestiges of the original sin concept from Christianity, where we're just automatically going to assume that people are bad, that people are liars, and that people are making things up. So I think this actually happened. So Ibn Arabi came from the upper echelons of Andalusian society, but due to his spiritual experiences and because he was an ascetic renunciant, he would thereby spend the rest of his life in the counter-current subculture of Andalusian thought, which in turn introduced him to the thought and movements of the above-mentioned counter-culture figures. In other words, with this video series here on, the Mu'tabirun movement of mysticism in Islamic Spain, or Sufism in Islamic Spain, or whatever you want to call it, Ibn Arabi had read and engaged with all the previous people that I had covered in this video series. So from Ibn Masarra all the way to Ibn Hazm, he engaged with them all. He talks about them all in his writings. He mentions them in the Futūḥāt. So he comes from a tradition that's already well established. He's very well read in it. And he is the culmination, the epitome of the Mu'tabirun movement. At the age of 18, the young Ibn Arabi was already studying with teachers of Quran, Hadith, the biography of the Prophet, and fiqh, Islamic law. Most of Ibn Arabi's teachers were Maliki, as it was the predominant school in the region, but it's also noteworthy that Ibn Arabi studied the writings of Ibn Hazm with Abdul Haq al-Ishbili, who was a disciple of Ibn Barrajan. It was in 1184, at the age of 19, that Ibn Arabi placed himself under the shuyukh and began traversing the path. So he began studying, pretty seriously Sufism and the various Islamic sciences that we just mentioned here. Ibn Arabi's first teacher was Abu al-Abbas al-Ārabī, who used to give oral commentaries of Ibn al-Arif's Mahasin al-Majalis, despite his illiteracy. So he taught it orally. So remember Ibn Arif, this is one of the figures in the previous videos here, and we talked about the text Mahasin al-Majalis. So Ibn Arabi is very much engaged with these previous figures. Of Ibn Arabi's numerous teachers, at least 5 were disciples of Ibn al-Arif, either directly or indirectly. As Ibn Arabi departed Andalusí for North Africa, he came across a sheikh in Tunisia, Abdul Aziz al-Mahdawi, who taught him Ibn Barajan's Kitab al-Hikmah in 1194. It was Ibn Arabi's time in Tunisia that opened a new chapter in his Odyssey, and it was from Tunisia that he began his itinerant life around the age of 30. I'm 29, so I can't imagine somebody, this caliber at the age of 30. And he acquired a small group of dedicated followers who traveled with him. When he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, he had a life-changing experience with the fetah, means young man or youth. Although he is spoken about as if he was an unknown person to the Sheikh al-Akbar, it was somebody whom he had already encountered in the Maghrib. Despite that, he did not actually know him. He didn't really know who this guy was. For when he arrived in Mecca, circumambulating the house, the Kaaba, he caught a glimpse of the reality of this young man, and his life changed forever. So, for those of you who don't know, this is like the first chapter of the al-Futūḥāt al-Makkiyya. He talks about this young man he encountered circumambulating the Kaaba, making tawaf, حول al-Kaaba. So he's going around, that black box there in Mecca. And he has this encounter with him that's very spiritual. This man was some sort of saint, some very spiritual person with a spiritual aura, who spoke in signs, who gesticulated, he pointed, and was able to communicate more than is communicable with words. Immediately, Ibn Arabi recognized the level of the enigmatic fetah, approached him, and the fetah, who is the walking embodiment of the Quran, transmitted to Ibn Arabi various revelations, Futūḥāt, which initiated his Meccan Revelations. That's al-Futūḥāt al-Makkiyya, the translation, Meccan Revelations. So this encounter is what started the whole, I guess you might say, idea for the book. He got this influx of spiritual information, gnosis, ma'rifah, from this individual. He had an intense spiritual experience with an influx of knowledge. For me, as an American who grew up with American pop culture, it reminds me of the movie Butterfly Effect. Where all of a sudden you get this influx of information, and he would get the nosebleeds. And for me, this is how I read into this, and maybe that's just my modern Western bias, but it's an influx of information all of a sudden that inspired a whole multi-volume book that's very intense. Although all of Ibn Arabi's writings are permeated with ubudiyya and sharia, Islamic law essentially, 3 in particular contain his thought regarding the 2 aforementioned topics: the Meccan Revelations, the Mawsilian descents, at-Tanazzulat al-Mawsiliyya, and the emplacement of the stars, Mawaqi' al-Nujum. Both the Mawsilian descents and the Meccan Revelations were written after Ibn Arabi's encounter with the fetah in Mecca. These 3 texts show a clear adherence of Ibn Arabi to the Zahiri madhab, Zahiri school of Islamic law. Ignaz Goldziher's original statement that Ibn Arabi was a Zahiri with respect to the ritual part of religion is totally correct. Ibn Arabi even envisioned that the Mahdi will judge Yahkamu on the basis of religion unobscured by Ra'i, i.e. most forms of ijtihad. So Ra'i was particularly attached to the Hanafis, and it kind of means like juristic discretion. Ijtihad is juristic reasoning, exertion of juristic thought in order to create an Islamic hermeneutics to create some sort of code of ethics or law, i.e. Sharia. You interpret Sharia and you make fiqh, the Islamic law. And that's ijtihad. And the Zahiri school was famous for rejecting ijtihad. And they say, no, we don't do these fancy type of reasonings. We take the text literally. Although they were using quite a bit of reasoning in order to interpret things literally. So it's a lot of it's just rhetoric, if you will. And so he was in disagreement with the teachings of the scholars in most of his rulings, the ahkam. On an extant manuscript of Ibn Hazm, as transmitted by Ibn Arabi, he gives an introduction to the work where he describes a vision he had. So Ibn Arabi, he writes on this text here by Ibn Hazm in his own introduction, and he writes about a vision that he had. I saw myself in the village of Sharaf near Seville. There I saw a plain on which rose an elevation. On this elevation the Prophet stood, and a man whom I did not know approached him. They embraced each other so violently that they seemed to interpenetrate and become one person. Great brightness concealed them from the eyes of the people. I would like to know, I thought, who is this strange man? Then I heard someone say, this is the traditionalist, Ali ibn Hazm. I had never heard Ibn Hazm's name before. One of my sheikhs whom I questioned informed me that this man is an authority in the field of the science of tradition, meaning that he specializes in Hadith. Goldziher goes on to note other contemporaries of Ibn Arabi who were Zahiri and says the period between the 6th century Hijri and 7th century seems also to have been the prime of the Zahirite school in Andalusia. So Ibn Arabi lived during the prime of the Andalusian school, the Andalusian Zahiri school of Islamic law. And the next video that I'm going to do after this is going to continue on this point. I'm going to show some evidence as to why I think Muhyiddin ibn Arabi is a Zahiri, an idiosyncratic Zahiri. He's got his own way of doing Zahirism, but for sure he's a Zahiri in my opinion. Even if you might want to call him a semi-Zahiri or whatever, his usul fiqh, his legal theory, his legal epistemology is very, very similar to that of Ibn Hazm and other Zahirite legal theoreticians. And, he just tweaks it a little bit to add his kind of Sufi, mystical, mu'tabar tweaks or things, to the epistemology. So it's subsumed under this mu'tabari, epistemology, but it's still Zahiri thought. And so the next video I'm going to dig more into that and kind of explain it and talk about some other academics' views on the legal thought of Ibn Arabi, some of the previous work, and that type of thing, and kind of try to discuss, where he stands legally. And so we'll look at the Futūḥāt al-Makkiyya, which is right here behind me, and try to get a better idea as to what's going on there legally with Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. And that will conclude my series on Islamic Spain, on the Mu'tabirun movement, And afterwards, I intend to make a video series on the history of the Hanafi madhab, the development of early Islamic law, the formative period of Islamic law, the time of Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abu Dawud al-Zahiri, and the likes. Sufyan al-Thawri, all these early figures, Layth, Awza'i, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, and all these types of early figures. And maybe, we can also look at some passages from Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba and Musannaf Abdur Razak as-San'ani, and so on and so forth, and look at this early period where you had the Ahl al-Ra'i, the Ahl al-Hadith, you had the Hanafis coming up, you had the Abbasid revolution and Harun al-Rashid's, codification of Islamic law, and Muhammad Shaybani and Abu Yusuf, the disciples of Abu Hanifa, and all of these things. And then we could talk about how it develops later in the medieval period, regional differences, and perhaps talk about, Hanafism in modernity. What are Hanafis doing now? And what are the developments and discussions and debates in the Hanafi madhab right now? And with that, I'll bid you adieu. Wada'an. Assalamu alaikum.